Number fashion judge laughed at black girl's dress went pale when Vogue's editor called it genius. Take it off the rack. Those were the first words Claudette Ashford spoke when she saw the dress. Not hello, not welcome, not even a glance at the girl wearing it. Just 3 words, flat and final, the way you'd speak to a coat check attendant about an umbrella left behind by someone unimportant. Naomi didn't move. She stood at the center of the Beaumont Grand Ballroom registration table, 17 years old, in a dress she had sewn herself over the course of 11 months, a floor-length gown in midnight silk and hand-stitched kente panels, coral and gold, and deep forest green. Every seam a conversation between 2 worlds she had spent her whole life straddling. She had carried it in a garment bag on 2 buses and a train to get here. She had pressed it with a damp cloth at 6 in the morning in the bathroom of her grandmother's apartment on the 3rd floor of a building on DeKalb Avenue where the radiator knocked all night and the hot water ran cold by 7. She had not slept, and she did not flinch. She looked Claudette Ashford directly in the eyes, not with anger, not with defiance, just with a stillness so complete it almost looked like she hadn't heard the words at all. The registration volunteers froze, every one of them, 6 people behind that table, and not one of them breathed. Claudette Ashford had no idea who she was looking at. In 48 hours, she would find out, and it would end everything she had spent 30 years building. Have you ever worked on something with your whole heart, brought it somewhere you believed in, and had someone look right through you like you didn't exist? Stay with me, because what happens next is something I need you to see from the very beginning. Let me take you back, 48 hours earlier. The apartment on DeKalb Avenue had 3 rooms, and one of them was Naomi's. Her grandmother, Celestine, had given her the back bedroom, the one with the window that looked out over the fire escape, and the catalpa tree that dropped its long brown seed pods onto the sidewalk every fall. Celestine called it Naomi's studio. Everyone else would have called it a bedroom with a sewing machine in it. But Celestine had always known the difference between what a thing was and what a thing could become. Naomi had lived with Celestine since she was 9 years old. That is the only fact you need about her mother. Some stories don't require elaboration. Some silences say everything. What you do need to know is this. Naomi was made in that back bedroom. Not the way the word is usually meant. Not born, not raised, made. Shaped, slowly, the way iron gets shaped, by heat and pressure and the patient hands of someone who believes in what they're working with. Celestine had been a dressmaker for 41 years. She had sewn communion dresses and debutante gowns and, one time, a wedding dress for a woman whose name Naomi would not learn until much later. She had worked from that same back bedroom for 30 of those years, using a machine that was older than Naomi's mother, a steel-frame Singer with a knee pedal worn smooth as riverstone. On the wall above it, she kept a single framed photograph, not a fashion plate, not a runway image. A woman standing in a doorway in Ghana, somewhere in the Ashanti region, in a cloth of such extraordinary color it seemed to glow even in the black and white print. Celestine had never told Naomi who the woman was. She said only that she was someone who understood that cloth was a language, and that language was power. Naomi learned to thread a needle at age 6. She learned to read a pattern at 8. By 12, she was correcting Celestine's patterns, not openly, never disrespectfully, just quietly rerouting a seam here, adjusting a dart there. Until the garment hung the way it was supposed to hang, Celestine would look at what she'd done and say nothing for a moment. And then she would nod, once, the way a master craftsman nods when an apprentice has finally understood something without being told. By 15, Naomi had stopped using patterns altogether. She saw the finished garment first, in her mind, complete, 3-dimensional, already moving. And then she worked backward from the vision to the fabric, the way a sculptor sees the figure inside the marble before the first chisel stroke. Celestine said it was a gift she had no name for, only that she had prayed for it every night for years and was grateful every morning it showed up again. The dress for the Beaumont Junior Design Competition had started as a dream, not a metaphor, an actual dream. Naomi had woken up at 3 in the morning with the image of it fully formed. Midnight silk, the kind that moves like water and holds light like a secret. Panels of hand-stitched kente cloth in the colors that Celestine called the colors of history. Coral for the clay roads, gold for the Ashanti stools, forest green for the rainforest canopy. The kente was not decoration. It was not an accent. It was the architecture. It was the load-bearing element. The silk existed to hold the kente the way a frame holds a painting, not to be seen itself, but to make the other thing more visible. She had sourced the silk from a fabric store in the garment district, 3 yards at $42 each. She had found the kente through a woman named Sister Adwoa, who ran a small import shop on Fulton Street, and who had, when Naomi explained what she was making, looked at her for a long moment, and then gone to the back of the store and returned with a bolt of cloth she hadn't shown to anyone. It was old. The colors were so saturated they looked almost wet. Sister Adwoa would not say how much it cost. She said only that some things you don't sell, you place, and then you wait to see what comes of the placing. Naomi had sewn for 11 months. Every night after school, every weekend, every holiday, she had ripped out seams and re-sewn them. She had repaired the silk 3 times in places where the needle had slipped. She had hand-stitched each kente panel individually, aligning the pattern repeats so that the geometric progressions flowed without interruption across the panel seams, a task that Celestine said she had never seen anyone attempt and never seen anyone complete. On the last night, the night before the competition, Celestine had come into the bedroom at 11 o'clock, when Naomi was still hunched over the final hem. She had looked at the dress for a long time. And then she had reached into the pocket of her housecoat and taken out a brooch. It was a small thing, not much larger than $50. Gold, or gold-plated. It was hard to tell in the shape of a spider, an Anansi spider, the 8 legs perfectly detailed, the body set, with a small chip of amber at its center. Celestine said that the brooch had belonged to her mother, and before that to her mother's mother, and before that she did not know. She said that in the old stories, Anansi was the keeper of all wisdom, the one who hid what was precious inside something small enough to overlook. She pinned it to the left shoulder seam of the dress, at the exact point where the midnight silk met the first kente panel. "Keep it on," she said. "Not for luck, because it belongs there." Naomi had looked at the dress then, complete for the first time, and she had understood something she hadn't been able to articulate for 11 months. This dress was not about fashion. It was about memory. It was about the woman in the photograph on the wall, and Sister Adwoa's bolt of wet color, and the knocked radiator, and the cold water, and the 2 buses and the train, and Celestine's 41 years, and the singer with the worn knee pedal, and the prayers she said every morning in the kitchen before the apartment woke up. This dress was all of it, all of them, compressed into silk and kente and 1 small gold spider at the shoulder. She carried it to the competition in a garment bag she had made herself from a white cotton sheet. She took the A train to the F train to the Q train. She arrived at the Beaumont Grand Ballroom at 7:45 in the morning, 45 minutes before registration opened, because she had been awake since 4, and there was nowhere else she would rather be. And then Claudette Ashford arrived. You need to understand who Claudette Ashford was, because the cruelty only makes sense in the context of the power. Claudette Ashford had been the head judge of the Beaumont Junior Design Competition for 11 years. She had founded the competition's current scoring rubric, a document she referred to simply as the standard, and she enforced it with the enthusiasm of someone who had mistaken rigor for righteousness. She had a column in a regional fashion trade publication. She sat on the advisory board of 2 design schools. She had, at various points over the previous decade, told at least 4 young designers whose careers she had ended that they simply weren't ready, which was her way of saying they were not what she had imagined when she imagined the kind of designer worth elevating. She came from old textile money. Her grandfather had owned mills in the Carolinas. She wore this fact the way some people wear a signet ring, not ostentatiously, but always present, always legible to those who knew how to read it. She had a way of not looking directly at people she had already decided about. She would speak to the space just beside them, or above them, or at something else entirely. It was a practice technique, and its effect was devastating. It communicated, without saying a word, that the person in question had not earned the dignity of her full attention. She walked into the registration area at 8:15, followed by 2 volunteers who had the posture of people accustomed to moving quickly, without being told to. She was wearing a cream linen blazer and carrying a leather portfolio that Naomi noticed was monogrammed, her initials in a looping gold script on the corner. She scanned the registration table with the brisk efficiency of someone conducting an inspection rather than a greeting, and then her eyes landed on the garment bag. Actually, they landed on Naomi first. And then they moved to the garment bag. And then, with the peculiar economy of someone who had already rendered judgment before seeing the evidence, she said it. "Take it off the rack." One of the volunteers started to say something, a syllable, barely, and then stopped. "It's not on the rack," Naomi said. "I'm holding it." Claudette looked at her then, fully, for the first time. And what Naomi saw in her expression was not malice exactly, it was something more efficient than malice. It was the dismissal that doesn't bother to become contempt, because contempt at least requires acknowledgement of the other person's existence. This was different. This was the look that says you are a category, not a person, and I have already sorted the category. "Then take it off your arm," Claudette said, "and remove it from the competition floor. Junior division entries are submitted through the registration table. If you want to enter, submit an entry form. If you want to exhibit work, find an art fair." She said it evenly, not loudly. The way you say something when you are so certain of your authority that raising your voice would feel like wasted energy. Naomi stood completely still. "I have a registration form," she said. "I completed it online. My confirmation number is in my phone." "That's wonderful," Claudette said, and she turned away. Not walked away, turned away. A rotation of the body that communicated with absolute clarity to everyone in that room that the conversation was concluded, the matter was settled, and the girl holding the garment bag was not worth a second look. But then she paused, and she turned back. And what she did next was the thing that crossed the line. The thing there was no coming back from. She reached out and took the garment bag. Not asked. Took. Slid it from Naomi's arm with one quick motion, the way you'd clear a plate from a table before the guest has finished eating. She unzipped it all the way, in one pull, and held the dress up, not with care, not with the reverence that a garment of that construction deserved. She held it by the shoulder seam between two fingers, like something lifted from a lost and found bin. The brooch caught the light. The Anansi spider, the amber chip at its center, the 8 perfectly detailed legs it caught the ballroom light and threw a small amber star across the registration table. Claudette looked at it, and something moved behind her eyes, not recognition, not appreciation, irritation. The way you look at a detail that has complicated a decision you've already made. She unpinned it. With 2 fingers and a quick, practiced motion that made a small sound, a tiny metallic click, and then she set it on the registration table without looking at what she was setting down. And the brooch tipped off the edge of the table and hit the marble floor. Nobody moved. It didn't break. That's important. It landed on its back and lay there, the amber chip facing up, the 8 legs in the air like a creature that had been flipped over and was waiting to be righted. Naomi looked at it on the floor. 1 second. 2. And then she looked back up. She did not cry. She did not raise her voice. She looked at Claudette Ashford with the same absolute stillness she had worn since the moment this woman had first opened her mouth, and she said, very quietly, "That belonged to my great-great-grandmother." Claudette said nothing. She draped the dress back over Naomi's arm, not into the bag, just over the arm, without ceremony, and said, "The preliminary judging begins at 10. All entries must be submitted and catalogued by 9. If your work meets the standard for submission, the volunteers will assist you." And she walked away. The volunteers at the registration table looked at Naomi, at the dress draped over her arm, at the brooch on the marble floor, at each other. One of them, a young woman with close-cropped hair and a volunteer lanyard that said her name was Kira, stepped out from behind the table and crouched down and picked up the brooch. She held it out to Naomi in her open palm, the way you'd return something fragile. Naomi took it, closed her fingers around it, held it for a moment. Then she bent down and unzipped the garment bag herself, eased the dress back inside with the care of someone returning a sleeping child to a crib, and zipped it closed. "I'd like to submit my entry form," she said to Kira. "Please." But what Claudette Ashford didn't know, what not a single person in that ballroom knew except the girl with the garment bag and the grandmother on DeKalb Avenue who was at that moment pressing her palms together in her kitchen, was that in the pocket of Naomi's coat was a text message she had received 3 weeks earlier, a text message that had changed everything. A text message from a name that, had anyone in that ballroom seen it, would have turned the marble floor beneath their feet into very thin ice. Hold on to that. Let me tell you about Celestine's hands. She was 73 years old, and her hands looked at not old in the way the word usually means, but old in the way that things get old when they have done exactly what they were made for long enough. The joints were enlarged from decades of needlework. The fingertips were calloused in specific places, the right index finger at the crease, the left thumb below the first knuckle, in the way a violinist develops calluses, not from damage but from devotion. She had come to Brooklyn from Kingston, Jamaica, at the age of 19 with a single suitcase, and, in the suitcase, a pincushion her mother had made for her, stuffed with Spanish moss and covered in a scrap of the finest cloth her mother owned. The pincushion was still on the windowsill above the singer. It was the first thing Celestine touched when she sat down to sew. She had learned her craft from her mother, who had learned it from hers, and so on back through a line of women who had understood even in the generations when their work was not called craft, not called art, not called anything at all, that the ability to make something from nothing was a form of power that could not be taken away, because it lived in the hands, not in the property. Celestine had taught Naomi everything, not all at once, and not from a curriculum. The way a language is taught by people who speak it fluently to a child who lives inside it, through immersion, through correction, through the 10,000 small moments that accumulate into knowing. When Naomi was 10, Celestine had given her the photograph, not the original, but a copy she'd had made at a print shop on Flatbush. The woman in the doorway, in the cloth that glowed, she said. Her name was Abina. She was your great-great-grandmother's sister. She was a kente weaver. She taught herself the men's patterns at a time when women were not permitted to learn them. They said it couldn't be done. She did it anyway. She said cloth was a conversation with the future, and she intended to be heard. Naomi had put the photograph on her wall, next to her desk, where she could see it while she worked. She had looked at it while she designed the dress. She had looked at it when she hand-stitched the first kente panel, following the geometric progression with a magnifying glass, and the patience of someone who understood that some conversations take a long time. She had looked at it on the last night, when Celestine pinned the Anansi brooch to the shoulder seam and the dress was finally, at last, complete. She did not know yet, she could not have known yet, that the woman in the photograph, Abina, whose kente patterns had been forbidden and whose work had been dismissed and who had done it anyway, was about to walk back into the room. Not as a ghost, as a vindication. The competition judging began at 10 o'clock. There were 14 entries in the junior division. Naomi had been assigned the last slot, which in competitions like this one meant one of two things. Either you were filler, placed last because the organizers had run out of time, or you were something the volunteers had quietly flagged. Something that had made a note-taker pause when she unzipped the garment bag during cataloging. Kira, the volunteer with the close-cropped hair, had been the one who cataloged Naomi's entry. She had spent 40 seconds looking at it before she wrote anything down. That is not a normal amount of time to spend looking at a competition entry. She had written, in the notes field of the entry form, 3 words, "Please see this." Those 3 words were not in the official record. They were on a post-it note she had stuck to the back of Naomi's entry card and passed to someone else, and that person had passed it to someone else, and it had been traveling for 2 hours by the time the judging panel took their seats. Claudette Ashford had 2 co-judges, a menswear designer from Philadelphia who had been on the panel for 3 years and had learned in those 3 years not to contradict Claudette's preliminary assessments, and a buyer from a mid-market department store whose job on this panel was, effectively, to nod. They sat at a long table at the front of the ballroom. 14 entries. 13 of them had been presented, evaluated, scored, and received back by their makers with the courteous but deflating handshake of a competition that had already decided who would win before lunch. And then Naomi carried the dress to the presentation stand. She had reattached the Anansi brooch herself, pressing it back into place at the shoulder seam with her thumb until she felt the clasp engage. She did not look at the judges when she unzipped the garment bag. She looked at the dress. She lifted it by the shoulders the way Celestine had taught her to hold a garment you respected, from the structural points, never from the fabric itself, and she placed it on the presentation form. Then she stepped back, and the dress spoke for itself. The midnight silk moved when the air conditioning cycled on. It moved the way water moves, without being prompted, finding its own surface. The kente panels, those coral and gold and forest green geometrics, aligned across their seams without interruption. The pattern repeats, flowing as if they had been woven this way. As one continuous piece caught the overhead lighting and held it differently than the silk did, with a depth that made the design appear three-dimensional, like something carved rather than sewn. The menswear designer from Philadelphia stopped writing. The buyer from the department store put down her pen. Claudette Ashford looked at the dress. She looked at it for 3 seconds, and then she turned to her scoring rubric. She said, "The kente application is decorative rather than structural. The design lacks conceptual cohesion. The fabrication, while technically competent, does not demonstrate innovation." "I'd score it a 6. The menswear designer glanced at the buyer. The buyer looked at her lap. Naomi said nothing. "A 6, Claudette repeated, writing it down. "We're on a schedule. Next." And that was when the phone rang. Not Naomi's phone. Not anyone's phone at the judging table. The phone of the woman who had just walked through the side door of the Beaumont Grand Ballroom, the door that was supposed to be locked, the door that led to the catering corridor, and who was now standing 15 feet from the presentation stand, with an expression on her face that was somewhere between fury and something it took a moment to name. It was recognition. The woman's name was Margaret Osei. She was 61 years old. She was the fashion director of Vogue, not a contributor, not a senior editor, the director. The one who decided, season after season, what got seen and what got buried, what became the conversation, and what got filed away. She had been at the Beaumont Grand that morning for a private lunch that had ended 40 minutes ahead of schedule. She had been walking through the catering corridor toward the parking structure, and she had passed, at the juncture of 2 hallways, a post-it note that had fallen from someone's clipboard, a small yellow square with 3 words on it. "Please see this." She had picked it up. She had read it, and she had turned around. She had been standing in the doorway for 6 minutes. She had watched Naomi carry the dress to the stand. She had watched the dress speak for itself. She had heard Claudette Ashford give it a 6. She had listened to the word decorative. She had listened to the word lax, and she had taken out her phone. Margaret Osei. That's what came through the phone when Claudette answered. "Just the name," said the way people say their own name when they are not interested in pleasantries as an identification, not an introduction. Claudette had answered the call because the number had no name attached to it, and people with power sometimes call from numbers with no names attached to them. She had stepped 2 feet away from the judging table and half turned toward the window. "Yes," she said. "I'm standing in your ballroom," Margaret said. "I'm looking at the dress that you just gave a 6. Silence. A very particular kind of silence. The kind that has weight and edges. "I'm sorry," Claudette said. "I don't believe The kente work on that dress," Margaret said, "is the most significant thing I have seen in a junior competition in 12 years. The way the panels have been aligned across the seams, that is not decorative. That is structural. That is the architecture of the piece." The designer understood something that most professional designers never understand. That cultural textile tradition is not an accent. It is a foundation. She paused. "And you gave it a 6. The menswear designer from Philadelphia had stopped pretending to look at his notes. The buyer had stopped looking at her lap. Everyone in the room was looking at Claudette Ashford's back. "I'm sure we can revisit I want to speak with the designer." Claudette turned around, and for the first time, something moved across her face that was not calculation. It was color. Or rather, the absence of it. Her face went from its usual composed pallor to something significantly less composed, a draining, a subtracting, as if the confidence had simply withdrawn from the surface. Because standing 15 feet away from her, fully visible, phone to her ear, was the fashion director of Vogue, and standing next to the dress that she had just called decorative was the girl she had taken the garment bag from that morning, the girl whose great-great-grandmother's brooch she had flicked off a table. The girl she had addressed as something between a category and a common faciens. Naomi did not look surprised. She looked the way she had looked every time Claudette had looked at her that morning, still. Completely, absolutely still. Margaret Osei walked across the ballroom toward the presentation stand. She did not look at Claudette. She looked at the dress. She looked at it the way Celestine had looked at it on the last night, with the attention that means something has been recognized, not admired. Recognized. Like hearing a word in a language you haven't spoken in a long time and finding that your mouth still knows the shape of it. "What's your name?" she said. Naomi, said Naomi. Naomi Celestine Kwame. Margaret looked at the dress one more time. Then she looked at Naomi. I want to know who taught you, she said. Ha, ka, 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 ka. Naomi touched the Anansi brooch at her shoulder. The amber chip caught the light. The 8 legs held still. My grandmother, she said, and her grandmother before her, and hers before that. Margaret was quiet for a moment. The kente patterns, she said. The geometric progressions. Where did you learn to read them? I didn't learn to read them, Naomi said. I learned to speak them. The room was very still. And then Margaret Osei did something that no one in that room would forget, and that several of them would describe differently when they told the story later. Some saying she smiled, and some saying she didn't exactly smile, but something in her face changed in a way that was better than smiling. She said, "This dress is going in the magazine. What happened in the next 72 hours would take 3 times that long to fully understand." The first thing was the phone call that Margaret made from the parking structure, standing next to a town car she had not yet gotten into. She called her creative director. She described the dress. She described the kente panel alignment. She described the midnight silk. She described the Anansi brooch. She said the word genius once, in the middle of a sentence, not as an exclamation but as a straightforward descriptive term, the way a structural engineer says load-bearing. Her creative director asked her to send a photograph. She sent 4. The creative director called back in 8 minutes. The second thing was Kira. Kira, the volunteer with the close-cropped hair who had catalogued Naomi's entry and written 3 words on a post-it note and spent 40 seconds looking at a garment when 20 was the standard, had also taken a video. She had taken it on her phone during the judging, 11 seconds of the dress in the overhead lighting, the silk moving in the air conditioning, the kente panels catching the light. She had sent it to 2 friends. One of them had posted it. By the time Margaret Osei was on the phone with her creative director in the parking structure, the video had been viewed 40,000 times. The caption said, Vogue director just called a teen's dress genius, and the judge gave it a 6. By midnight, 400,000. By morning, 3.2 million. The third thing was what someone found. It always takes someone finding something. In these stories, some piece of record that was sitting somewhere waiting for the right moment to become relevant. What was found? By a fashion journalist in Atlanta who had been tracking the story since Kira's video and who had grown up 3 blocks from Claudette Ashford's family home, was a complaint. One complaint, filed 8 years earlier, with the board of the Regional Design Council that administered the Beaumont competition. The complaint had been filed by the mother of a 16-year-old designer, a girl from an HBCU prep program, who said that her daughter's entry had been scored a 4 by Claudette Ashford, and that the written notes on the scorecard had described the work as culturally specific in a way that limits its broader applicability. Culturally specific in a way that limits its broader applicability. The journalist published the complaint at 11 o'clock in the morning, alongside 5 other cases she had spent 14 hours reconstructing from emails, forum posts, and interviews with former competition participants. The cases spanned 9 years. They shared a pattern. The pattern had a name, which was Claudette Ashford. The article was titled, The Standard. By noon, it had been shared 80,000 times. The Beaumont Cultural Foundation, which administered the junior design competition, held an emergency board meeting that afternoon. The meeting was scheduled for 2 hours and lasted 4.5. The chair of the foundation, a woman named Dr. Patricia Elmore, who had been a civil rights attorney before she became a philanthropist, had read Kira's video caption and the Atlanta journalist's article before she sat down and had arrived at the meeting already knowing what she was going to do. What she did not yet know, because she was waiting for the foundation's legal counsel to confirm it, was how much it was going to cost. The answer, she would learn over the next 3 weeks, was considerable. Claudette Ashford was removed as head judge of the Beaumont Junior Design Competition at 4:17 in the afternoon of the day Margaret Osei's phone had rung in the ballroom. This was not announced publicly. What was announced publicly, at 9 the following morning, was that the foundation was undertaking a complete review of its judging criteria, its scoring rubrics, and its selection process for panel judges. The announcement was 3 paragraphs long and used the phrase commitment to equity 7 times. Dr. Elmore had written it herself, and she had written it the way she used to write briefs, with the precision of someone who knows exactly what she's saying and is not particularly interested in cushioning it. The Regional Design Council received, over the following 2 weeks, 114 requests for review of historic competition scores. Requests from designers who had entered between 1 and 12 years ago, who had seen Kira's video and read the Atlanta Journalist's article and recognized something in Claudette Ashford's language. The council hired 3 independent reviewers. The review process took 6 months. It resulted in 23 revised scores, 4 formal apologies, and 2 settlements that the council's communications director described as resolved to the mutual satisfaction of all parties, which is the language you use when you don't want to say what the number was. The regional trade publication, where Claudette Ashford had a column, announced 3 days after the emergency board meeting that her column was going on indefinite hiatus. The column never returned. One of the 2 design school advisory boards she sat on accepted her resignation. The other asked for it. The hashtag, and there was of course a hashtag, because there is always a hashtag, which means there is always a record, was the standard. Not because anyone had planned it, because Claudette had named her own rubric, and the name turned out to be perfectly suited for a different purpose. Under the standard, hundreds of people shared their own stories, of work dismissed, of scores given without explanation, of feedback that had nothing to do with the work and everything to do with who had made it. The conversation was enormous, and it was not finished, and it was built on the foundation of 11 seconds of midnight silk moving in an air-conditioned ballroom. The Vogue feature ran 8 months later, in the October issue. The photographs were shot in Celestine's apartment on DeKalb Avenue, not in a studio, not against a backdrop. On the fire escape, with the catalpa tree visible in the frame. In the kitchen, where Celestine's pincushion sat on the windowsill, and the morning light came in at an angle that made everything look like something worth remembering. In the back bedroom, where Naomi stood at the singer with the photograph of Abena on the wall behind her. The dress was on the cover. Naomi was wearing it. The Anansi brooch was at her shoulder. The amber chip visible even in the thumbnail version of the image, a small golden light that drew the eye before you even knew what you were looking at. The headline was one word: genius, not a question mark, not a qualifier. Just the word, in the white space above the image, in the spare Vogue typeface that for 93 years had been how the magazine said, "Pay attention." Margaret Osei wrote the feature herself. She did not do this often. She had done it, in her career at Vogue, 4 times, twice for retrospectives on designers who had died, once for a profile of a working fashion collective in Lagos, and once, 20 years ago, for a piece about a woman who had changed the way the industry thought about something fundamental. The 5th time, she wrote it for Naomi. She wrote about the Kente panels. She wrote about the geometric progressions and what it meant to align them across seams, the mathematical precision, the textile history, the fact that the patterns Naomi had used were Asante royal patterns that had been documented but rarely reproduced, because the reproduction required a level of structural understanding that most contemporary designers did not have. She wrote about Abena, about the photograph on the wall, about Celestine's hands and the singer and the pincushion stuffed with Spanish moss. She wrote about a line of women who had understood that cloth was a conversation with the future. She wrote, "The girl in this photograph did not arrive at the Beaumont Grand Ballroom needing to be discovered. She arrived having already been prepared. The failure was not hers. It was the room's. It is always the room's." Naomi read that sentence sitting at the kitchen table on DeKalb Avenue, the magazine open in front of her, Celestine across the table with her coffee. She read it twice, and then she looked up at Celestine. Celestine was already looking at her. "She got it right," Celestine said. The Celestine Kwame Foundation was established 14 months after the Beaumont competition, with a combination of a grant from Margaret Osei's personal foundation and a contribution from Vogue's Social Equity Fund. Its mission, stated in 12 words on its founding documents, was to find what the room has not yet learned to see. It offered annual stipends to young textile designers from underrepresented communities, not competition prizes, not scholarships for admission to schools that would then decide whether to take them. Direct stipends, to work, to develop, to have the time and the materials to make what they were going to make, without having to wait for a room to decide it was worth seeing. In the first year, The foundation funded 11 designers. In the second year, 19. Naomi was 20 years old when the foundation held its first public showcase at a venue in downtown Brooklyn that Naomi had chosen because it had good natural light and because it was 7 subway stops from DeKalb Avenue. Close enough for Celestine to get there without changing trains. Celestine wore a dress that Naomi had made for her, not silk, not kente, linen, in a deep indigo, with a collar that sat exactly right, the way a collar sits when the person who made it knows the person who's wearing it. She wore the Anansi brooch at her shoulder. She sat in the front row. When Naomi spoke at the opening, she spoke for 4 minutes, and she didn't use notes. She said that craft was not the same as talent. That craft was talent multiplied by time, multiplied by someone who believed in you before the room did. She said that her grandmother had given her 41 years of knowing before she ever set foot in a competition, and that what the room had called a 6 was what 41 years of knowing looks like when it finds its way into the hands of someone young enough to carry it somewhere new. She looked at Celestine when she said it. She said, "I am not the beginning of this. I am what happens when something that has been going for a very long time finally gets to be heard." And then she sat down, and the showcase began. If this story moved something in you, and I believe it did, because you're still here, and something in you knew before you finished that this was worth staying for, I want you to like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe, hit the bell, because we have more stories like this one, and you do not want to miss what comes next. And I want to ask you something right now before we go any further. Have you ever brought something you made with everything you had into a room that didn't know how to look at it? Tell me below, because that conversation matters. Your name in those comments matters. But here's what really gets me when I sit with this story. It's not the magazine cover. It's not the hashtag or the lawsuits or the 3.2 million views. It's that post-it note, 3 words, "Please see this," written by a volunteer who had been in that room for 6 hours and had seen 14 entries and had seen something in 40 seconds that a woman with 30 years and a published rubric and 11 years of authority could not see in an entire morning. Because Kira wasn't looking for what fit the standard. She was just looking. She was paying the most basic, simplest form of attention, the kind that doesn't require credentials, doesn't require a rubric, doesn't require anything except the willingness to actually let something arrive. And the question I keep asking myself, and the question I want to leave you with, is this. Whose work are you walking past? Whose garment bag are you not unzipping? Whose kente panels, whose 41 years of knowing compressed into something that doesn't look like what you expected genius to look like? Are you giving a 6 because you've already decided what a 6 looks like? The dress was always a 10. The room just hadn't learned the language yet. What's the thing in your life that's been waiting for someone to learn the language? Tell me in the comments. I want to know.